homeowners are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Hi, I'm Brian Hyde. Welcome to Know Where to Hide. Today we're going to spend some time talking about imaginary versus real threats. And believe me, there's a lot going on out there. And a lot of the things that we're being told we should be afraid of, well, they just may not actually be real crises. But someone wants us to think that they're so. Case in point, let's talk about Jim Jones and his one-note symphony about sending the hate mongers packing. This is a commentary that Jim wrote for the, well, it was published actually in idahopress.com as well as Idaho Public, or Capital Sun rather.com. Idaho must once again send the hate mongers packing. Now, he's talking about a new group, Unite Against Hate, that will need the buy-in and vocal help from local elected and business leaders by speaking out against white supremacy. All right, guest columnist Jim Jones. First of all, I'm just asking you in all seriousness, where is white supremacy on the ascendancy? And I'm talking in your day-to-day life, in the workplace, in your church, in your school, in popular culture. Where is it in ascendancy? Notwithstanding Ye's, manic breakdown on Alex Jones's show. Even then, I wouldn't accuse him of white supremacy so much as a guy who needs to get back on his medications. But why is Jim so insistent? Well, we've got to unite and we've got to stand up. And in fact, he takes a lot more forceful language. Take a look at this. Jim Jones says, hate and bigotry often lurk just beneath the surface of civil societies, where presumably only people with extremely refined senses of insight and perception can see it or detect it. The rest of us just have to take him at his word, I suppose. So long as a society is united in disapproving of hateful words and actions, those evil twins will remain suppressed. And again, I'm going to ask you, where can someone pop off using, either hateful language or acting hatefully towards other people in a public setting where people wouldn't speak up and say, that's wrong? I can't think of a single place. So this doesn't appear to me to be the kind of threat that Jim's making it out to be. But he says when they receive official approval, from whom, I might ask, they rise to the surface and infect society like a virus. A society must maintain continued vigilance to keep them in check. Now, he goes on to say that business leaders from across the state will also have to weigh in big time. I think the correct phrase is bigly, but maybe Jim doesn't want to be mistaken for Donald Trump here, to get the message across that Idaho is too great for hate. Businesses will have to stop merely paying lip service to the problem and speak forcefully with their voices, and more particularly with significant financial resources to support those who run as human rights advocates, and to oppose those who won't. No more pussyfooting around with those sympathetic to the nationalists and the extremists just to get tax cuts and other favorable business legislation. This is an all-hands-on-deck endeavor. That sounds kind of mandatory. It kind of sounds like what the Jacobins would have said in the French Revolution. You're either with us or you're against us. But again, the idea that Idaho is too great for hate, where exactly is Jim getting the impression that somehow this is a safe haven and, everybody comes here because, we're all down to hate. We all hate each other. I hate my neighbor. They hate me. We talk hatefully at the dinner table. It's just, that's just normal part of life. No, it's not. In fact, one of the reasons why there is such an immense amount of population coming to the Gem State is because this is a state where common sense is still common. It's really pretty easy to find. And part of that common sense comes from people treat each other the way they would like to be treated. Not everything is a political contest, although Jim seems to certainly favor making it so that the state can get in there and force, people to have correct attitudes and correct ideas. But I'm going to come back to the idea that this fear of hate taking over Idaho is mostly imaginary. Now, compare that to some of the things that Jim is very quick to dismiss, like the teaching of CRT, whatever it may be called by today in one of its various forms in the classroom, teaching kids, race-based distaste for themselves or for others based on the color of their skin. That seems like a really poor idea, and it seems like it's straight out of the leftist victim oppressors playbook. How about his take on people who would stand up against, activism, LGBTQ activism in the classroom, in the library, in public, drag shows aimed at children? Now, some people like Jim say, well, that's just, we've looked into it. Nobody can seem to find this. But no, those are very real things. And we've seen the footage, we've seen the newspaper articles on it. It's a very real thing. So the difference is Jim is teaching us to be fearful and afraid of this crisis of hate, which appears to be mostly imaginary. I mean, if you looked hard, you could probably find one or two people with toxic points of view. But I guarantee you, they're not all going to be white supremacists. Some of them are going to be hardcore left-wing woke activists who have extremely toxic points of view. Still, they're a tiny minority compared to, do I dare say, normal society, which is where most of us find ourselves. Now, the people who are pushing that hardcore left-wing agenda, that's not a figment of our imaginations. I'm going to turn to some commentary from Brandon Smith from alt-market.us. Now, he specifically was talking about the shooting at the Club Q nightclub in Colorado Springs. You remember this from just a little over a week ago? A gunman went in, shot 5 people to death, I believe, wounded 19 people. And the press and commentators on the left jumped all over this because they just knew it was a white supremacist, MAGA hat-wearing, semi-automatic toting, right-winger who did this. And in fact, they very quickly assigned the blame for this is because there are people speaking out hatefully against LGBTQ activism or against, drag queen story hour, whatever it was. The bottom line is they said any opposition to LGBTQ activism is what causes this. And then suddenly the story has disappeared. Can you find anybody talking about it today? No. You know why? Because the shooter, it turns out, was part of the pronoun gang. A non-binary individual who goes by they, them pronouns, an angry, confused young man who turned to murderous behavior. That's sad. And it doesn't mean that all LGBTQ pronoun gang people are a part of this, but isn't it funny how quickly that narrative fell apart like a soup sandwich and suddenly, well, there's really nothing to see here. Yeah, because your narrative was false. So Brandon Smith says the fact remains you cannot separate the political left from the tragedy whoring and crisis opportunism they employ. Without constant calamity, leftists serve no purpose and have no platform. They need disaster to remain relevant. They need panic as a tool for centralizing power. They need the populace to be constantly afraid, mostly of threats that do not exist and suspicions that are misplaced. You see the difference? They'll attempt to gaslight and claim the conservatives are somehow the same, but he says we're not. We are not afraid of what we think they might do. We stand in opposition to what they are already doing. We aren't concerned about phantom enemies and imagined crises. We are concerned about the very real antagonists on our doorstep. Now, he says this is one of the many differences between leftists and conservatives. We're not going to attack fellow Americans for things they've not done, nor suspect people without evidence. We are only interested in stopping the trespasses that are happening right in front of our eyes, whether that be, people, twerking, men in lingerie twerking in front of children, whether it be salacious pornographic books being, portrayed to kids as, oh, this is great. You can access this in your school library or in the public library, or otherwise, grooming kids to be little leftists. That is happening. And he says we aren't going to be victimized while our attackers pretend to be victims. And we aren't going to pretend we don't see agendas that are obvious. Most of all, to the best of our ability, we rely on the truth to make our case, while leftists rely on deceit and spin. A little something to keep in mind here is every parent should ask, why does age limit all of a sudden cease to matter when you slap a rainbow flag on it and call it safety and inclusion? That's a fair question. I don't have an answer for you, but I'm coming back to the idea. Real versus imaginary. There are some things that are a very real threat. There are some things that are very imaginary. We would do well to distinguish between the two. And I'm confident that right now, those who are standing up for truth and those who are standing up for freedom are on the side of standing up against real threats, as opposed to the imaginary boogeymen who see white supremacy and racism and hate around every corner. Okay, one final story. This one really hits home. Look at this headline. A woman had to move out of her tiny home after one day because the city threatened to fine her $1,000 a day. Now, this didn't happen in some left-wing, ultra, control freak enclave. This happened in Meridian, Idaho. And just the bullet points of the story are this. A woman is suing the city of Meridian, Idaho over its ban on living in mobile homes. Chastity Decker bought her tiny home because she couldn't afford a traditional house. I mean, over the last year and a half, the Treasure Valley area has been one of the highest cost real estate markets in the entire country. Not surprising, finding affordable housing is very difficult. City officials told her she can't live in her tiny home legally despite paying rent to park it in a yard. Now, I ask you, what is it that makes this such a terrible thing? Why did authorities have to intervene? Further in the story, Robert Belden, a lawyer with the Institute for Justice, told Business Insider, everybody needs a place to live, but the city would rather have Chastity be homeless than living in a tiny home on wheels parked on private property. That's not just wrong, it's unconstitutional. Making Chastity homeless does nothing to improve public health, safety, or welfare in Meridian, and it certainly doesn't improve Chastity's. At a time when so few affordable housing options are available, why is the city's zoning ordinance further reducing such options? Here's the kicker, too. It was a neighbor who called police and got the state involved or the city involved in the first place. What does that say about the sickness in that person's heart or their soul that they couldn't leave well enough alone? It wasn't their property. They weren't the ones who came up with the agreement that told this young woman, yes, it's okay for you to park your home here and pay me rent to live on my property. Seems to me that this is something that is not just exclusively from the left or the right-wing side of the political spectrum. That's a sickness of soul that needs to be rooted out at the individual level, that lust to control other people. And the fact that it didn't happen in a blue enclave, it happened in Meridian, Idaho, that's a pretty mainstream city. I don't think you could classify Meridian as hardcore red or blue. I think it's probably one of the places I would put up there, and I know people hate this word, but that's a pretty normal place. So why do people have to act like that? Well, people would say, and I know there are people on both sides of the political spectrum who would say, Brian, the reason that has to happen is because this could happen, or this could happen. It could drive down property values, or she could have, some kind of a wastewater spill, or there could be any. Okay, that's the imaginary stuff. That's the stuff that your mind or your imagination is telling you could happen, but what actually happened? Go on, you know the answer. She lived in her home for one day. There was no victim whatsoever. Yet government interfered and intervened, and now she's expected to be better off homeless than living against those zoning ordinances. Common sense. Yeah. It's not always so common. And I guess the point is, even in places where, people are for the most part pretty normal, you can still find some real inconsistency. This is why we have to be, aware. This is why we have to be on guard. And most importantly, why we have to understand the principles and the practices of freedom, which include honoring private property rights. Something to think about: real versus imaginary threats. You're going to encounter more of them as you go on. If you can really tell the difference, well, you're going to be in better standing than the people who can't. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.